Albania's economic history is a tale of transformation, marked by isolation, centralized control, and gradual integration into the global economy. From its early days as part of various empires to its modern status as an upper-middle-income country, Albania's economy has evolved through distinct phases shaped by political upheaval, structural reforms, and external influences. Below, I'll trace this history decade by decade, incorporating GDP growth percentages and numbers where available, and provide context for Albania's economic journey. Data points like the example provided $18.88 billion, 4.84%, etc. will be included as relevant, with figures drawn from available sources or estimated based on historical trends. Albania's pre-modern economy was agrarian, shaped by its geography and centuries of foreign rule under the Ottoman Empire 15th to early 20th century. The region was largely rural, with subsistence farming, limited trade, and no significant industrial base. Economic activity revolved around agriculture, local craftsmanship, and trade routes controlled by Ottoman authorities. No GDP data exists for this period, as modern economic metrics weren't applied. The economy was fragmented with tribal structures and limited infrastructure. Albania declared independence from the Ottoman Empire in 1912, but the decade was chaotic. World War I and internal power struggles disrupted economic development. Prince Wilhelm zu Wiede's brief rule 1914 collapsed, leaving Albania fragmented. The economy remained agrarian, with minimal industrialization. No reliable GDP figures exist, but the country's output was negligible, centered on subsistence agriculture and small-scale trade. Under King Zog, the first reigned 1928 to 1939, Albania attempted modernization but faced challenges due to political instability and limited resources. The economy relied heavily on agriculture, with some early efforts at infrastructure development. Foreign investment, mainly from Italy, began to influence the economy, but GDP data is scarce. Growth was likely minimal, as Albania remained one of Europe's poorest regions. Italian economic influence grew, with investments in infrastructure and mining. However, Albania's economy remained underdeveloped, with agriculture dominating. Industrial output was limited and GDP per capita was among the lowest in Europe. No precise GDP growth rates are available, but economic progress was slow, hampered by political dependence on Italy, which occupied Albania in 1939. World War II and the Italian/German occupations disrupted Albania's economy. Post-war, Enver Hoxha's communist regime took power in 1944, nationalizing industries and collectivizing agriculture. The economy became centrally planned, focusing on self-sufficiency. GDP data is limited, but the war and transition to communism caused economic contraction, with recovery starting only late in the decade. Growth rates were likely negative or near zero. Hoxha's regime pursued rapid industrialization and agricultural collectivization. The government invested in mining, energy, and heavy industry, often with Soviet aid until 1960 and later Chinese support. Agriculture remained the backbone, employing most of the population. GDP growth data is sparse, but state-driven projects led to modest growth, likely in the low single digits annually, as the economy was constrained by isolationist policies. Albania's break with the USSR 1960 and alignment with China led to further isolation. The economy focused on self-reliance with limited foreign trade. Industrial output grew in sectors like mining and textiles, but inefficiencies and lack of technology stifled progress. Agriculture remained dominant with small-scale farming. GDP growth was likely 2 to 4% annually, but per capita income remained low, reflecting Albania's status as one of Europe's poorest nations. The 1970s saw continued state-led industrialization, with Chinese aid supporting infrastructure projects. Hydropower plants and factories were built, but the economy suffered from outdated technology and isolation. Agriculture accounted for a significant share of GDP with limited mechanization. GDP growth estimates suggest 3 to 5% annually, but data is unreliable due to centralized reporting. Per capita GDP remained among Europe's lowest, likely under $1,000 PPP adjusted. By the 1980s, Albania's isolationist policies led to stagnation. The economy relied on agriculture over 50% of employment and declining industrial output. Energy shortages and poor infrastructure hindered growth. GDP growth slowed to 1 to 3% annually, with real GDP per capita estimated at $2,000 to $3,000 PPP. The ban on foreign loans and investment kept Albania economically isolated, exacerbating poverty. The fall of communism in 1991 marked a turning point. Albania transitioned to a market economy, but the early 1990s were chaotic. with GDP contracting sharply due to the collapse of state enterprises. By 1992, nominal GDP hit a low of $0.65 billion. 1993 to 1995, rapid recovery, driven by agricultural growth and privatization. Real GDP grew by 11.1% in 1993, 8.9% in 1994, and 11.9% in 1995, largely in the private sector. 1996 to 1997, progress stalled due to pyramid scheme collapses in 1997, triggering a 5.9% GDP contraction and social unrest. The lek lost half its value, and GDP dropped by 0.08%. Late 1990s, recovery began under new leadership, with GDP reaching 1989 levels by 1999. Nominal GDP grew to around $3 to $4 billion by decade's end. Albania pursued macroeconomic reforms with IMF and World Bank support. Privatization of banks, for example, savings banks sold to Raiffeisen in 2004, and infrastructure investments spurred growth. Remittances, 15% of GDP, and tourism began to contribute significantly. 2000 to 2005, average GDP growth of approximately 5.9% annually, driven by construction and services. Nominal GDP rose from $4.68 billion in 2000 to $8.05 billion in 2005. 2006 to 2009, growth continued at 5 to 6% annually, though the 2008 global financial crisis caused a slight slowdown, 3.3% in 2009. Nominal GDP reached $12.19 billion in 2009, with GDP per capita at $4,085, PPP $8,959. Albania weathered the global financial crisis better than many, with no negative growth years except 2020. Tourism, construction, and remittances drove growth, though agriculture remained a key employer, 40% of workforce. 2010 to 2014. GDP growth averaged 2 to 3% annually, with a setback in 2015, 2.2%. Nominal GDP grew from $11.93 billion in 2010 to $13.27 billion in 2014. 2015 to 2019, growth stabilized at 3 to 4%, peaking at 4.1% in 2018. Nominal GDP reached $15.28 billion in 2019, with GDP per capita at $5,435, $13,961 PPP. Unemployment fell from 17.3% 2015 to 11.6% 2020. The COVID-19 pandemic hit Albania's economy, but recovery was swift, driven by tourism and construction. 2020, GDP contracted by 3.3%, with nominal GDP at $15.24 billion. Population, 2,842,321. GDP per capita, $5,373, $12,282 PPP. 2021, strong rebound with 8.91% growth. Nominal GDP reached $18.03 billion. 2022, growth of 4.86%. Nominal GDP was $19.02 billion. GDP per capita, $6,643, $14,327 PPP. 2023, growth at 3.44%. Real GDP was $14.88 billion constant. 2010 USD. GDP per capita, $5,293. 2024, growth estimated at 3.9%. Nominal GDP reached $27.18 billion, or approximately 25 billion euros. GDP per capita, 10,300 euros. 2025 Q1, growth at 3.39% annualized. Projections estimate 3.2% for the year, with nominal GDP forecasted at $29 billion. Albania's economy in 2025 is classified as upper middle income, with a focus on tourism. 10 million tourists in 2023, agriculture, and digitization. Nominal GDP is projected to reach $36.14 billion by 2029, with annual growth averaging 3.2 to 3.47%. Public debt has fallen to 54% of GDP 2024, targeting 50% by 2030. Challenges include a large informal economy, infrastructure deficits, and emigration of skilled labor. EU accession talks started 2024 and regional connectivity are expected to drive future growth. Albania's economic history reflects a shift from Ottoman-era subsistence farming to communist centralization, post-communist turmoil, and gradual market-oriented growth. The 1990s marked a low point, with GDP dropping to $0.65 billion in 1992, followed by robust recovery, 11 to 12% growth in 1993 to 1995. The 2000s and 2010s saw steady 3 to 6% growth driven by reforms, tourism, and remittances. Despite challenges like corruption and infrastructure gaps, Albania's GDP reached $27.18 billion in 2024, with per capita income at €10,300, aiming for €15,000 by 2030. The economy remains reliant on agriculture and services, with tourism and construction as key drivers, positioning Albania as an emerging player in the region.